Welcome once again to Short Story Theater. This is your host, Bill Russo, inviting you to step inside the Wacks Museum. Our museum is not about figures made of wax, W-A-X, but it is about wax, as spelled W-A-C-K-S, wax, as in whack jobs. The odd, the unusual, the offbeat. And it is the offbeat that creates urban legends. And urban legends is what you will see and you will hear in this episode. Just what is an urban legend? I guess we'd all agree that it is a story that starts with a small incident and gradually morphs into a tale of the bizarre and the extraordinary. Generally, the stories are about 10% fact and 90% myth. The two exhibits we are going to examine today do not fit that mold. Both of these urban legends are 100% true, though they do contain elements of fear and mystery. We're going to tell you the very odd saga of the Green Man and the bittersweet story of the Crying Boy. Now, here's our Basil Nightingale. He'll be your guide to these two unusual exhibits in the Wacks Museum.
Thank you, Bill. The Green Man exhibit is one of the strangest you will ever see, or hear, and we will get to it shortly. But first let's walk over to the Crying Boy exhibit. I'm standing in front of a wall of paintings. Each one shows an angelic-faced young boy, with sad eyes, and a tear trailing down his cheek. They were painted by a struggling young artist named Gio Bragolini. Gio was a painter on demand. Just after the Second World War, in the late 1940s and 1950s, he wandered the streets of Venice, setting up his easel at street fairs, and in front of shops. He always painted a variation on the same theme. A young boy, most likely an orphan, a homeless street urchin struggling to survive. A tiny lad with grim lips, big sad eyes, and always with a tear-stained cheek. His Crying Boy style featured children with tear-stained eyes, staring glassy-eyed, straight ahead. Bragolini knocked off his paintings hastily and sold them for nickels and dimes. Really, he sold them for a few lire, just enough money to buy bread, brushes, and more paint. Gio's fortunes improved slightly when a sharp-minded businessman saw a chance for a profit. He teamed up with Gio Bragolini to reproduce the paintings. They sold cheap prints of his originals and did fairly well, managing sales of some 50,000 or so. It was enough to allow Gio a steady income but not much more. Gradually he did become rich and millions of his prints were sold. But the reason for his fame and fortune was that the prints were considered cursed. And now, to continue the tale, here is Short Story Theater's Matthew Larbook.
Thank you, Basil. The question is, how can the sweet-faced, tearful subject of Gio Bragolini's paintings have been turned into something fearful and cursed? The answer is in two parts. First, once a struggling artist, a painter on demand who worked the streets for pennies, Gio Bragolini agreed to the deal that made him enormously wealthy. He permitted an entrepreneur to strike thousands of prints from his paintings, which were distributed through the country. By the 1980s the copies of The Crying Boy were sold all over the world. If you happen upon an original print, you'll be happy to know it's worth some money. Though hundreds of thousands were made, the chances of you finding one are very slim. Second, the British tabloid, The Sun, ran a sensational story that created a huge demand for The Crying Boy. In its edition of September 5, 1985, The newspaper interviewed a firefighter from the village of Essex, and here is what he told the reporter.
All of a sudden all through the UK, fires were breaking out, in houses that had pictures of the crying boy on their walls. And almost every time there was a fire, when we walked through the charred remains of the house, we would find a copy of that crying boy picture. The frame would be partly burned, but the picture of the boy with the tear running down his cheek was undamaged, even as everything else around him was charred and burned. It happened many times. We always found the crying boy, undamaged, amidst the ruins of burned houses. I'll say it again, I will. Though some houses were completely burned, the prints of the crying boy were virtually untouched. No firefighter that I know will permit the crying boy in his house. The print is cursed. It seems like it starts a fire, and then takes great pleasure in watching everything around it burn down, except for the picture itself.
Reams of copy in the Sun and other newspapers ran over the next several months, as a mania swept England and the world. It was said that several house fires occurred in sundry parts of the nation. In each case the house was a total loss, but the crying boy survived the inferno unscathed. The interesting part of this urban legend is that it really is very nearly 100% true. Independent tests showed that the prints did tend to be almost fireproof. Was it a curse, or something far more mundane? British comedian and writer Steve Punt came up with the answer in a program he did for BBC Radio around 1990. Though his show was slanted towards comedy, his studious research offered solid clues as to why the crying boy prints withstood flames that should have reduced them to ashes in seconds. At a professional research facility outside of London, Steve Punt found the two simple reasons for the phenomena. 1. At the manufacturing plant where they were made, a varnish containing a fire-retardant chemical was sprayed onto the prints. 2. In the event of a house fire, the twine holding the print to a wall flamed up so quickly that the print would fall from the wall long before it became fully engulfed by the fire. When it dropped, the print would land face down and be further protected from heat and flame. The artist Gio Bragolini had no knowledge of the manufacturing process, though he did earn a great deal of money from the prints. To end the supposed curse of the crying boy, the Sun newspaper asked readers to send in their prints of the crying boy, and all those submitted would be burned up in a great bonfire. A large number of readers did indeed send in their crying man prints, and they were destroyed, but still, thousands remain on the walls of homeowners around the world. And it's likely that in future, there will be another fire, and another crying boy will survive, and once again, the curse of the crying boy will be a front-page story for the infamous British tabloid, The Sun.
We're headed for the next exhibit now. The Wacks Museum takes great pleasure in bringing you The Green Man. As curator of the Wacks Museum, our producer and author, Bill Russo, had some reservations about whether to present this next exhibit. As you will see and hear, the Green Man had virtually no face. Life must have been unspeakably difficult for him. An object of fear, scorn, hate, and ridicule, how could he have walked among the normals? Many of the other exhibits in the various rooms of the Wacks Museum are based on legend, and short story theatre has no problem in expanding, or bending the tale, in hopes of making it more eerie, or exotic. In the sad narrative of the Green Man, no such amplification has been made. These are the actual facts, and details of a life, lived as best as possible, under dire circumstances. Still want to see the exhibit? Okay, let's go inside. I'm holding a photo. It is a picture of Raymond Robinson, born in 1910, in Pennsylvania, United States of America. The photograph was taken when he was 40 years old. For all but 9 of his 74 years, this photograph is how he appeared. A man with no nose, no mouth, just one ear, and only one arm. Even more striking than the sight of a man with almost no face, was this. His skin was the color of the Statue of Liberty, giving him the name that would be with him for the rest of his days. the Green Man. During his life and for decades afterward, Mr. Robinson's appearance, and his habit of taking long solitary, nocturnal walks, despite being totally blind, launched a number of legends, and urban myths. It was said that the Green Man would jump out from the trees alongside a roadway, and try to lay his hand on a car. If he succeeded, the car would have motor trouble. Other tales claimed he would stalk lovers' lanes, to frighten the people parked in the cars. Some stories told of the Green Man being spotted in caves, and tunnels hundreds of miles from his home near Beaver Falls. According to a number of news sources in Pittsburgh, as well as Philadelphia, thousands of people spread wild yarns about the scary Green Man, without realizing that he actually was a real person, not a myth, or a Hollywood character. Here now, from the files of newspapers in Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and Beavers Falls, Pennsylvania, are the true facts of the Green Man, as reported by our Matthew Law book.
Dateline. Dateline, Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania. A normal, healthy male child, was born to Robert and Louise Robinson, on October 29, 1910. The child was given the name, Raymond. As he grew, young Ray was a fine-looking lad, who had a warm smile and made friends easily. Like most kids of the era, he spent most of his free time playing outdoors. The usual summertime activities of boys in the early 20th century included games of baseball, hide-and-seek, and horseshoes. Swimming in the Beaver River was also a favorite pastime on warmer days. As the Great War, now called World War I, spread across the planet, young boys began playing soldier games. By 1919, when Ray was 9 years old, the United States had been in the war for 2 years. More and more area children became fatherless as the battles took their toll. Ray lost his dad at the start of the war when he was just 7. His mom remarried, and she had a total of 7 children, with Ray being the oldest. Capture the Flag, and other war games, became increasingly popular as the conflict dragged on. Each boy tried to outdo his friends in contests of skill and daring. Perhaps that's why Ray did what he did, when he and his friends approached the trolley bridge, connecting the communities of Beaver Falls and Big Beaver. Everybody said the bridge was a killer. In the autumn of the previous year, a 12-year-old boy died, while playing with a group of friends, on the large wooden structure. He touched a high-voltage electrical transmission line, and was fried almost instantly. Ray and his friends knew the unfortunate boy. He was a few years older, but like them, he was from Beaver Falls, where most everybody knew most everybody else in town. As the boys continued to chat nervously about the accident of the year before, somebody spotted a bird's nest in a beam, very near the top of the bridge. Perhaps it was a dare. It could have been simply that Ray wanted to show off his climbing skills. Nobody knows for certain why 9-year-old Raymond Robinson began scaling that high bridge. Maybe he just wanted to see how many eggs were in the nest. He never found out. Because he never got there. About halfway up, the unlucky boy grazed a 2,200-volt power line. A puff of smoke burst from his head. And his face melted in an instant. The smell of barbecued flesh assaulted the noses of his friends, just as Ray's nose, and one ear, slid off his face, in a steamy puddle. His eyelids were immediately fused together, forming a tight cover over the boiling eyeballs inside. One arm sparked up like the fuse of a firecracker, with sizzling, hissing flames surging down from his shoulder to his fingertips, leaving nothing but ashes in their wake. He never screamed. Not one sound came from his throat. It was just too fast. Everything happened in a single second. If he had been stuck to the power line, he would have been reduced to cinders in about 1 minute. But as quickly as it maimed him, the cruel power line repelled him, pushing him away, and plunging him down to the tracks of the bridge. Horror-struck, his friends stood mute. They were frozen with fear, as sickening smells and sights filled the air. They started to regain their senses, but were afraid to move because the killer power line periodically hurled flashes of lightning bolts at them. After a time they realized the dangerous electrical discharges were being absorbed by the iron rails bolted to the wooden trolley ties. Freed of their fright, they ran to the smoldering thing that had been Raymond Robinson. Though they didn't believe it possible that he could still be alive, the boys sprinted to town for help, leaving 2 of the group to remain with the lifeless, smoking pile of burning flesh. Of course he would die. Everyone in the hospital knew it. So did the newspapers in Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, Beaver Falls, and even in Boston at the Globe, and in New York at the Times. Yes. Yes, my friends, somehow, Raymond's heart was still beating. But the death watch was on. It was only a matter of time. Everyone said so. They were still saying so a week later, and 2 weeks later. But not a month later. By the end of 30 days, the horribly maimed youngster was alert, and mending as well as could be expected. By miracle, or surgical skill, his life had been saved, and his voice also was saved, but not his sight. He was totally blind. Though he had only a single ear, it worked. Ray could speak and hear. He astounded the doctors with his good humor and determination. After making a remarkable recovery, he was sent home to live with his family. He left the hospital with a smile and a good attitude. He also left without a few things. He departed without a nose, with no eyes, with only one arm and just a single ear. These deficiencies alone would have made young Raymond Robinson a very unusual-looking person, but the most striking thing about his appearance was his skin. Ray's wounds became infected shortly after the accident, and although the physicians halted the spread of it, the infection changed his skin color into a permanent shade of green. Though he was never able to be entirely on his own, he lived with his family, and survived to the age of 74. As a young adult he displayed considerable talent, using his single hand to craft leather goods, wallets, belts, and such. He also weaved rubber doormats. His goods were sold in a shop downtown. He didn't make a living from this activity, but it occupied his time, and his mind, and gave him some pocket money. Ray lived quietly, and was well liked and accepted, in his neighborhood. His nieces and nephews took little note of his disabilities, and were impressed with his skills and handiwork. It's likely that Raymond Robinson would have lived and died without ever being known outside of Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania, but for one thing: his penchant for walking. Perhaps if he had done his walking during the day, people would have grown accustomed to seeing him, and he still would have remained largely anonymous. But Ray didn't want to walk in the daylight hours. He thought that his appearance would cause a commotion. So he began taking late-night strolls. Being blind, the darkness was no more a handicap to him than the daylight would have been. With cane in hand he tapped his way through the neighborhood and headed for Highway 351. Dragging his stick along the edge of the roadway as a guide, he walked for miles. Sometimes he'd leave the house at 10 at night and not come home until 2 in the morning. There were occasions he didn't come home at all, dropping down at the edge of the road and sleeping for a few hours, before making his way back to his house around dawn. Raymond Robinson continued his strolls, summer and winter, nearly every night for some 30 years. Along the way he became a legend to several generations. People began to come to the area from hundreds of miles away, just for a chance to see the Green Man. A few people got to know Ray by bringing him presents. Beer and cigarettes could sometimes draw him from his hiding places behind trees to the edge of the road. The occupants of the car rolled down their windows and gave their gifts to Ray, who stood by the side of the car chatting with those inside, while he sampled their gifts. As the years went on, it's said that Ray became a prodigious sampler of the beers he was given, and spent many nights walking home, not only blind, but blind drunk. Though he was bumped a time or two by cars, it's amazing that in all his nocturnal travels, he was never seriously injured, neither by car, nor by falling down, or by crashing into trees or other objects. As for his visitors, it became a mark of distinction if a person became a friend and regular visitor with Ray. Young men wishing to make an impression on girls would bring the object of their affection to meet Ray. It was said that seeing the Green Man made the girls cling very tightly to the boy who brought them. And apparently this was the object of the visit, from the male point of view. As he neared 70, Ray's health began to deteriorate and he abandoned the long nocturnal walks that highlighted his life for close to 40 years. He passed away in a nursing home 4 years later, and though he had not walked along Highway 351 for several years, reports kept coming in, as you will hear. From the WBVF newsroom, here's a breaking news bulletin from correspondent Wendell Walter.
Flash. Dateline Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania. A scary green man with just one arm and only half a face emerged from woods alongside Highway 351 last night and threatened a husband and his wife who had pulled off the road to get something from the trunk of their car. The man waved a large walking stick, menacingly like a club, as he marched towards them. They got in their car and drove away as fast as they could. Local police are investigating the incident.
Reports of a similar nature poured into the newsrooms of the Pennsylvania papers and radio stations for decades after Ray's passing. People who heard about the Green Man were shocked to find out that the legend actually was based upon solid fact. There really was a green man who roamed Highway 351 on foot. He was not a monster. He never threatened anyone with his cane. If he met with insults, which happened far too often, Ray simply turned and walked away. The 2,200 volts that crippled and maimed his body could not put a dent in his heart, his spirit, or his soul. If you ever go to Pennsylvania near Beaver Falls and Highway 351, and you hear scary tales of an evil, green-skinned monster lurking in the trees alongside the road, don't listen to them. The Green Man, Ray Robinson, was a gentle, handsome, and good-natured person who was trapped inside a melted face. This is Basil Nightingale speaking. And that is the final exhibit today in the Wacks Museum. This episode of Short Story Theatre comes from our producer Bill Russo, and it is part of his book, The Wacks Museum. As always, our Wacks is spelled W-A-C-K-S. The book is free for all, on Smashwords. That's it for now. Please like us on Facebook, and share our episodes with others. One other thing, please come back again soon. Won't you?